Swaran Singh, the EAM points to managing the contradictions within Asia because he talks about Asia having diversity, but he points also to ASEAN as a meeting ground. How crucial is the role of ASEAN, do you see, in seeing balanced growth in Asia moving forward?
Thank you, Mark. I think this underlining of ASEAN centrality is something that most major powers have agreed upon. But what is interesting here in today's speech by External Affairs Minister is what is not said. That part is more interesting.
Yes.
And reading between the lines, I think, is interesting. Much of the speech clearly alludes to China, but only once actual mention of China towards end of the speech. And the underlying sentiment articulated is how, given the diversity of Asia, Asian century is likely to make India much at home because India is already a diverse society and we celebrate unity in diversity. We are perfectly at home with the diverse impulses around us, voices around us, and by implication, without directly saying so, the disadvantage that could accrue to countries like China, which are relatively monolith,
Yes.
largely one language, one ethnicity, one political system, one party. So in that sense, pointing out advantage India, and second, I think very interesting point of how recognizing the realities on the ground and not being kind of
Right.
too overtly idealist. For
Right.
example, he mentions whether the idea of Asia for Asians is any more relevant or feasible, practicable. He clearly wants to be far more pragmatic in looking at how Asian century can be realized
Sure.
and how countries like India and China will play a role, will coordinate where they can, and will contest where they must.
Indeed. Professor Swaran Singh, the EAM spoke about connectivity needing to be more transparent, viable, and market oriented. In the same sentence as he spoke about sovereignty and territorial integrity needing to be respected. So, can China's BRI be used as an infrastructure to boost Asia's growth, or will it impede it based on, the principles that China is adopting? Because it's looking at a one-way street.
I think that's interesting. The last word of one-way street that you used is interesting part of BRI. Whether it is China's trade or it is China's investments, given advantage of being one-party ruled state with deep pockets, it is able to continuously, carry on one-sided relationships in building economic partnerships, which are not sustainable because they are not commercially viable. And why they are being pursued then leads to insinuations, whether it is certain reasons being seeking political influence, strategic outreach. What explains that one-sided engagement or indulgence that China has shown in several, even the conflict-ridden societies around Asia in that sense? And problems of debt trap which flow from there, problems of lack of transparency that flow from there, capturing markets, using political influence. These are issues which Sri Lanka is a good example of what kind of assets have been created by China and how viable they are and what results they have led to. So in that sense, India presenting itself along with several other nations as a country that wants to focus on regulation, on transparency, on quality control, on fairness, in creating standards of how transactions should happen rather than sort of pursuing transactions one-sided, which are not sustainable. And in that sense, I think there's a clear indication of, without really directly saying those things, as to how China is pursuing a course which is not sort of sustainable in that sense. And how India looks at that kind of connectivity being built. And very quickly, Mark,
Yes.
mention of connectivity not being restricted to only physical connectivity of building bridges and ports and airports. In fact, sometime I believe that's what Europeans were doing 250 years ago in several Asian societies, coming and building railways and roads and other places like that. Connectivity today also means people-to-people connectivity,
Yes.
goodwill connectivity,
Yes.
electronic connectivity, innovation connectivity, the
Right.
whole range of other areas where I think India's services sector in that sense need to be noticed. which sometimes when you compare the trade that China does, manufacturing that China does, but look at the services that India provides, and that kind of helps in building the blueprint as to how global governance will move forward. And those, I think, are elements which are interesting, and I think given the fact that great tradition that Asia Society Policy Research has had for almost last 60 years plus, it was an address, I think, which was meant to people who are already in great knowledge of the subject he's talking about, and therefore that's why I said reading between the lines and reading what is not said is more interesting than what is said.
So, Ambassador Manji, the role of a rising Asia in the world order, because that at the end of the day is what the EAM was talking about. And he describes Asia as the most dynamic region beyond the West, which successes in Asia can inspire the whole global South. So at the end of the day, it is India's success which is going to be inspiring for the global South.
I think as EAM himself very clearly underlined, it's the broader historical trends of demographic changes where you have much younger population across Asia, resulting in greater productivity because of infusion of technology. So growth rates around the world are today led much by the Asian countries in that sense. So there is a manifest destiny, as Ambassador Puri just mentioned, which is where Asia is located, and India is located along with that Asia. And very similar to the nature of diversity across Asia is something that India is feeling comfortable at home and has lived with it and has celebrated it. So in that sense, I think there is a greater appreciation across Asia of India becoming more acceptable increasingly. And it's interesting to see how India today has friendly relations with almost all the major powers, and in fact several emerging and middle powers as well. West Asia often is a good example where India is friendly to Iran, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Israel, countries that very often don't see eye to eye with each other but are friendly to India. So that kind of positive welcoming approach that world is showing towards India is something that clearly makes us feel that in that manifest destiny, as we are saying, of Asian century, 21st century becoming Asian century, would definitely put India as a much desired partner in that sense. And that kind of understanding among Indian leadership is clearly much visible today. And that's why the kind of articulations that you see, which are becoming far more pragmatic, rather than idealistic in that sense, and looking at the realities on the ground, looking at the fact that Asia cannot be exclusive kind of an area for Asians. It has to engage with all across the world, other major powers. United States is the resident power, as EAM said in his speech. So in that sense, comfort level with the realities on the ground and possibilities of making a great contribution. And very quick last point, there is no doubt, I mean, even the globally known institutions like World Bank, IMF, they have clearly recognized that this year, for example, India is going to be the fastest among large economies to grow between 7 to 8%.
Right.
So because Asian century is driven primarily by economic development, I think India's growth rates should give another confidence boost to India's leadership in that sense, and that is why these kind of articulations are becoming very acceptable and very regular affair. EAM recently gave another very sort of a groundbreaking speech in Chulalongkorn in Bangkok, where he again looked at India's vision on Indo-Pacific. So it is time that when India is ready to articulate how it sees itself contributing to the rise of Asia, and also the world is beginning to listen what India thinks its role will be and how it wants to engage with other major stakeholders.
Indeed. Ambassador Manji Puri. Final word from you, Professor Swaran Singh. The conflict in Ukraine, suddenly came upon the world, and we are seeing, potential conflict likely in the Asian theater as well now, and China being provoked. So, what do you think? I mean, in a situation like this, going forward, how do you look at your Asia if there are these kind of irritants within the growth story?
Two things, Mark. I think first, if I was a Chinese, I would look at Ukraine as an example of being far more cautious of taking that kind of aggressive stance against Taiwan. Because if Ukraine could stand up against Russia, Taiwan has a very special relationship with the United States, which Ukraine doesn't have at this stage. So I think that's a first lesson that Chinese should draw. Second important thing to look at Ukraine crisis is how this is going to be looked upon as an inflection point in India's foreign policy, asserting itself as a country that is willing to stand by its own national interests. India has clearly showcased how very well calibrated, nuanced neutrality it has held. It has not denounced Russia. It has at the same time increased imports from Russia. But look at the same time sending humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. And also, recently, for example, voting against a Russian proposal of disallowing President Zelensky to speak online to UN Security Council, basically not towing either side in terms of towing their line, but looking at how India views the reality on the ground. And India has a very clear understanding of people on the ground must not be made victims because leaders at the top are not willing to come to terms and talk to each other. And therefore, India is pursuing that possibility of cessation of dialogue, cessation of violence and beginning of dialogue. But at the same time, 12 consignments of about 100 ton has gone already to Ukraine in that sense. So, example of a very well calibrated, nuanced neutrality in a situation like this and standing by that kind of foreign policy is something that will be remembered as an inflection point where India begins to showcase that it is not belonging to any of the two sides or three sides, but it has its own side and it is pursuing its own national interests.
We leave it there. Thank you very much.